Some folks will look straight through you like you're made of dust, and the worst part ain't the way they treat you. It's how long it takes before anyone bothers to ask your name. The train had already pulled out of Red Willow by the time Evelyn stepped down onto the platform, the last of its smoke trailing off into a pale blue sky, like something that didn't plan on coming back. And for a moment, she just stood there with her gloved hand resting on the worn handle of her valise, feeling the quiet settling around her the way it does in places that don't expect anything new to arrive. The boards beneath her boots creaked soft, sun-warmed, carrying the weight of a town that had seen too many strangers come through and not enough stay. And when she finally started walking, it wasn't fast, wasn't hesitant either, just steady, like she'd already decided she wasn't turning around no matter what waited ahead. The dust in the street rose in thin curls around her hem as she made her way toward the main row of buildings, a general store with a faded sign, a post office with peeling paint, and a narrow office with a window that caught the light just right. The kind of place where papers got signed and decisions got made about who belonged and who didn't. She pushed the door open with a soft scrape, and the sound of it drew a few eyes her way, not curious, not welcoming, just measuring. The way folks look at something they've already decided the worth of. There were 3 people at the counter, a man in a pressed vest, a woman with a hat pinned too tight to her head, and another man leaning back on his heels like he had nowhere else to be, and none of them moved to make space for her. None of them said a word. Evelyn waited anyway, standing just inside the doorway, her hands still on that valise like it was the only thing anchoring her there. And after a long enough stretch of silence, the man behind the counter glanced up just once before returning to his ledger, as if that was answer enough. "You'll have to wait," he said, not unkind, but not kind either, just flat, like she'd asked for more than she had a right to. She nodded once, though she hadn't spoken, and stepped aside, letting another woman brush past her without so much as an apology, the scent of rosewater trailing behind like something from a different world. Time moved slow in that room, measured in the scratch of pen on paper and the low murmur of voices that didn't include her, and every so often someone would glance her way, then look past her, as if she were part of the wall, something fixed and unimportant. Outside, a horse shifted, leather creaking in the heat, and a man stood just beyond the window, hat tipped low, watching without seeming to watch, his posture easy but his attention sharper than the rest of the room combined. Inside, Evelyn adjusted her grip on the valise, the leather worn smooth where her fingers had held it too long, and when the woman at the counter let out a small, impatient sigh, it was clear enough what she thought of the girl waiting by the door, the one with dust on her skirt and no one to speak for her. Still, Evelyn didn't step forward, didn't raise her voice, didn't ask to be seen. She just stood there, quiet as a held breath, as if she understood something the rest of them didn't, that sometimes the difference between being nothing and being remembered came down to a single moment, and whether anyone in the room cared enough to notice it when it arrived. The man by the window did not move when the others shifted, and that alone set him apart in a town that seemed to measure everything by motion and noise. Wyatt Mercer stood with one shoulder against the frame, the brim of his hat casting a shadow that kept most folks from reading his expression, but his eyes were clear enough when he chose to use them, and right now they were resting on the woman who had not spoken a word since stepping inside. He had seen plenty of travelers come through Red Willow, some loud, some desperate, most gone by morning. But there was something different in the way she held herself. Not proud exactly, not broken either, just steady, like a fence post that had weathered more storms than it cared to count. Inside, the room carried on without her, the man at the counter closing his ledger with a soft thud before turning to the woman in the hat, offering her a polite nod and a voice that warmed by a few degrees, and it did not take much to see the pattern, how courtesy seemed to follow certain kinds of people while skipping over others entirely. Evelyn watched it all, without letting it settle on her face, her gaze moving from the shelves lined with folded papers to the window where the light cut across the floorboards in long, pale stripes, and for a moment her fingers loosened on the handle of her valise, just enough to adjust her grip, just enough to remind herself she was still holding on. "You looking for work?" the man at the counter finally asked without really looking at her, his tone carrying the kind of assumption that made the question feel more like a statement. Evelyn lifted her eyes to him, calm and level, and gave a small shake of her head. "No, sir," she said, her voice quiet but clear, the kind that did not need raising to be heard. There was a pause then, brief but noticeable, like the room had tripped over something it had not expected. The woman in the hat let out a soft, dismissive breath and turned away, already done with the interruption, and the man behind the counter followed her lead, reaching for another paper as if the matter had been settled without needing to be understood. Outside, a breeze picked up, carrying the faint scent of dry grass and sun-warmed wood through the open window, and Wyatt shifted his weight just enough to catch a better angle, his gaze narrowing not in suspicion but in focus, the way a man looks when he realizes there is more to a thing than what sits on the surface. Evelyn took a step closer to the counter then, not pushing past anyone, not forcing her way in, just moving when there was space to do so. And when she spoke again, it was with the same measured tone. "I am looking for an address," she said, and that seemed to interest no one at all until she added, "It was given to me in a letter, and that, for reasons no one could quite explain, caused the man by the window to lift his head a fraction higher. Letters mattered out here. They carried weight that voices sometimes did not, and Wyatt's attention settled fully now, not on the dust on her dress or the wear on her shoes, but on the way she chose her words, careful, deliberate, like each one had a place it was meant to land. Inside the room, however, the reaction was less thoughtful, the man at the counter giving a short, impatient nod toward a stack of notices pinned crooked on the wall. "You can check there," he said, already half turned away, as if pointing was the same as helping. Evelyn followed the gesture with her eyes, but did not move toward it. Not yet. And for a moment she stood there between being dismissed and deciding what to do next, the silence stretching thin but unbroken, until from the doorway came a voice that had not been part of the room before, low and even, carrying just enough weight to make itself heard without asking permission. "What kind of letter?" Wyatt asked, not stepping inside, not claiming the space, just standing there with his hand resting lightly against the frame, as if he had all the time in the world and no intention of wasting it on anything that did not matter. Evelyn turned her head toward him then, meeting his gaze for the first time, and something in that brief exchange shifted, not loudly, not enough for the others to notice, but enough to change the way the moment felt, like the first crack in a door that had been shut too long. The room did not welcome questions, not the kind that asked for more than what was offered on the surface, and for a second no one answered him, not because they did not hear, but because they were deciding whether the question mattered. The man at the counter shifted his weight and let out a breath through his nose, the sound carrying a quiet irritation that had less to do with the words and more to do with who had spoken them. And the woman in the hat turned just enough to see past Evelyn, toward the doorway, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the man standing there like he had not asked for permission to be part of the conversation. Evelyn held Wyatt's gaze for a moment longer than most would have dared, not bold, not challenging, just steady, and when she spoke, it was as if she had already decided the answer was his and not theirs. "It is from an attorney," she said, her voice even, "sent from back east." And that was enough to stir something in the air, not interest exactly, but a shift, like the room had taken a small step closer without meaning to. The man at the counter straightened then, just a fraction, his attention returning in a way it had not before. "Attorney, you say?" he replied, slower now, measuring the word as if it carried weight he had not accounted for, and Evelyn gave a small nod, her hand moving to the front of her coat where a folded envelope rested, the edge of it worn from travel but still sealed, the paper thick enough to hold its shape. She did not rush to pull it out, did not offer it up like proof to be examined. She simply rested her fingers there for a second, as if reminding herself it was real, and then let her hand fall back to her side. Outside, a wagon rolled past, the wooden wheels grinding soft against the packed dirt, and Wyatt stepped one pace closer to the doorway, not entering, just closing the distance enough that his voice no longer had to carry. "You came a long way for a letter," he said, not a question this time, more like an observation, and Evelyn's eyes flickered to him again, something unreadable passing through them before settling back into that same quiet composure. "I came because it was addressed to me," she answered, and there was a kind of finality in the way she said it, as if that alone explained everything that needed explaining. The woman in the hat gave a small, dismissive laugh under her breath, the sound light but sharp. "Plenty of letters get sent to the wrong people," she said, turning fully now, her gaze traveling from Evelyn's boots up to the dust along the hem of her dress. "Does not make them important." And a few of the others in the room shifted in quiet agreement, the kind that did not need words to be understood. Evelyn did not look at her, did not respond. She simply stood there, the silence around her changing shape, no longer empty, but held, like something waiting its turn. Wyatt watched that, the way she let the comment pass without shrinking, without hardening either, and something in his expression settled, a decision forming in the quiet spaces between words. "Mind if I take a look at that letter?" he said, his tone unchanged, steady as before, and for the first time since she had walked in, the room seemed to hesitate, as if unsure whether this moment belonged to them anymore. Evelyn considered him for a brief second, not weighing the risk so much as recognizing it, and then, with a small movement that carried more trust than it had any reason to, she reached into her coat and drew the envelope free, holding it in her hand without extending it yet, her thumb resting along the seal, her name written across the front in careful ink that had not faded despite the miles it had traveled. The light from the window caught on the paper just enough to make the letters stand out, and though no one else stepped closer, there was a sense that something had shifted in the room, something quiet but certain, like the first hint that what they had taken for nothing might not be nothing at all. The envelope rested in Evelyn's hand a moment longer than necessary, not out of hesitation, but because once it left her fingers, something unspoken would begin that could not be taken back, and she seemed to understand that better than anyone else in the room. Wyatt did not reach for it right away. He simply stood there, close enough now that the dust on her sleeve and the faint crease along the edge of the paper were details he could see without effort, and when he finally extended his hand, it was slow, deliberate, the way a man handles something that might matter more than it appears. Evelyn placed the letter into his palm without a word, her fingers brushing the air where it had been just a second before, and then she let them fall back to her side, empty now, but no less steady. The man at the counter leaned forward, his interest no longer hidden, and the woman in the hat shifted closer as well, though neither of them spoke, as if words might disturb whatever was unfolding. Wyatt turned the envelope over once, his thumb tracing the edge of the seal, not breaking it yet, his eyes moving instead to the front where the name had been written. The ink slightly faded at the edges but still clear enough to read, and for a brief second, something in his expression changed, subtle, almost gone before it fully formed, but not unnoticed. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the window, carrying with it the dry scent of the late afternoon, and inside, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a sound that had not yet come. "You have not opened it," Wyatt said, his voice low, more observation than question, and Evelyn shook her head once, a small movement. "It was not meant to be opened by anyone else," she replied, and there was no pride in it, no challenge, just a simple truth stated the way one might mention the weather. The man at the counter cleared his throat, a sharp sound in the quiet. "If it concerns town business, it ought to be reviewed properly," he said, the authority in his voice returning now that there was something tangible to lean on, and Evelyn turned her head just slightly toward him, not enough to fully face him, but enough to acknowledge the words without accepting them. "It concerns me," she said, and that was all. No explanation offered, no defense given. Wyatt's gaze remained on the name, his mind moving through pieces that did not quite fit together yet, the kind that take time and silence to settle, and then, with a careful motion, he broke the seal, not hurried, not hesitant, just steady, the paper giving way with a soft sound that seemed louder than it should have been. He unfolded the letter, the crease opening along a line that had been pressed down for miles, and his eyes moved across the page once, then again, slower the second time, as if confirming something that had already taken root. The shift in him was quiet but certain, like the moment a man recognizes a trail he has seen before, and when he finally looked up, it was not at the others in the room, but at Evelyn, his gaze direct now, no longer measuring, no longer uncertain. The silence that followed was different from the one before, heavier somehow, carrying weight where there had only been absence, and even those who had not seen the words on the page could feel that something had changed, though they could not yet name it. Wyatt folded the letter back along its crease, careful in the way he handled it, and held it for a second longer before offering it back, his voice quieter than before, but firmer too. "You should keep this close," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that made it sound less like advice and more like understanding, the kind that comes from seeing something others have missed, even when it has been sitting in plain sight all along. The letter returned to Evelyn's hands carried a different weight now, not heavier in the way of paper and ink, but in the way something becomes real once another person has seen it and understood what it means, and she held it a moment before tucking it back into her coat, her fingers smoothing the edge as if setting something back into place. The room, however, had not settled the same way. The man at the counter watching Wyatt with a narrowed gaze, the kind that comes when authority feels itself slipping without knowing why, and the woman in the hat leaned in just slightly, her curiosity no longer hidden behind polite distance. "Well?" the man finally asked, his voice edged with impatience now. "If it concerns business here, we ought to know what we are dealing with." And the words hung in the air, not directed at Evelyn, but not entirely separate from her either. Wyatt did not answer right away. He simply shifted his attention from Evelyn back to the room, his posture unchanged, his presence quiet but no longer ignorable. And when he spoke, it was not louder than before, but it carried farther. "It concerns her," he said, echoing Evelyn's earlier words without embellishment, and something in the simplicity of it made it harder to argue with than any long explanation would have been. The man behind the counter frowned, his fingers tapping once against the wood. "That may be, but folks do not just walk into town with letters from back east and expect things to move on. They're say alone," he replied, trying to pull the moment back into something familiar, something he could control. Evelyn stood where she had been, her shoulders straight, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet shift in her now, not visible in her posture so much as in the stillness itself, as if the ground beneath her had settled into something firmer than before. Wyatt glanced at her once, brief but certain, and then back at the man. "No one is asking you to move anything," he said, his tone even, "just to listen long enough to understand what is already set." And that gave the room pause, because it suggested that whatever had come in that letter was not a request at all, but something decided before any of them had a chance to weigh in. Outside, the sound of boots crossed the porch, slow and deliberate, then faded again, leaving the quiet inside to stretch a little further, a little tighter. The woman in the hat shifted her stance, her earlier confidence thinning at the edges. "And what exactly is set?" she asked, her voice softer now, though not kinder, and Wyatt did not look at her when he answered, his gaze remaining steady. "That she is expected," he said. And there it was, simple as that, a word that did not raise its voice but carried further than any argument in the room. Expected meant someone had been waiting, meant a place had been held, meant this was not a mistake or a misdirected letter or a passing traveler hoping for luck. The man at the counter straightened fully now, his earlier dismissal gone, replaced by something closer to caution. "Expected by who?" he pressed, and for the first time since she had entered, all eyes turned to Evelyn not as something overlooked, but as something that might answer a question they had not known to ask before. She did not rush to speak, did not fill the silence out of discomfort. She simply drew a small breath and let it out, her gaze steady as it moved from one face to another before settling nowhere in particular. And when she answered, her voice was the same as it had been from the start, quiet, clear, and certain. "By the one who sent for me," she said, and though she did not add anything more, the words seemed to open a space in the room that had not been there before, a space where assumptions no longer fit quite as easily as they had only minutes ago. The word lingered in the room longer than it should have, expected, settling into corners and across faces that were no longer as certain as they had been just minutes before, and for a brief stretch no one spoke, as if each person was quietly turning it over, testing its weight against what they thought they already knew. The man at the counter adjusted his stance, his authority not gone but no longer resting easy on his shoulders. "And who exactly would that be?" he asked, slower now, his voice careful where it had once been dismissive, and Evelyn did not answer right away, not because she did not have the words, but because she chose when to use them, and that choice alone seemed to shift something in the air. Wyatt watched her, not pressing, not stepping in, just waiting the way a man waits when he understands that some answers carry more weight if they are given freely. Evelyn's hand moved once more to the front of her coat, not to take the letter out again, but to rest there briefly, a small, grounding gesture. And when she finally spoke, her voice remained steady, unchanged by the attention now fixed on her. "His name is written there," she said, nodding slightly toward the letter she had just put away. "And I was told he would be here, or someone who speaks for him." And that was enough to send a quiet ripple through the room, because it suggested that whoever had sent for her held a place that reached farther than the walls they stood inside. The woman in the hat let out a softer breath this time, her earlier sharpness dulled by uncertainty. "People say many things in letters," she murmured, though it lacked the conviction it once had, and even she did not seem fully persuaded by her own words. Outside, a gust of wind brushed along the porch, the loose board near the step giving a faint knock that echoed briefly before fading. And inside, Wyatt pushed himself off the doorframe, taking a slow step into the room at last, not with force, not claiming anything, but with a quiet intention that drew the space around him into a different shape. "You came looking for a name," he said, his eyes settling on Evelyn again. "And you found a room full of folks who never asked for it." And there was no accusation in his tone, just a simple truth laid out where everyone could see it. The man at the counter opened his mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, the words not forming as easily as they might have before, and in that small hesitation, something of the old order slipped further out of place. Evelyn met Wyatt's gaze, and for a moment there was something like recognition there, not of him as a man she knew, but of the fact that he had seen something the others had missed, not in the letter, but in her. "I did not come to be believed," she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach every corner of the room. "I came because I was asked to come," and the distinction mattered more than it sounded, because it placed the weight not on her need, but on someone else's decision. Wyatt gave a slight nod, as if that confirmed what he had already begun to understand, and then he turned his attention back to the others, his voice calm, but carrying a steadiness that left little room for dismissal. "Then the question is not whether she belongs here," he said. "It is whether any of us know enough to say she does not." And that settled over the room in a way nothing else had, not loud, not forceful, but certain, leaving behind a quiet that felt less like absence and more like the space before something important finally comes into view. Silence settled again, but it no longer felt like something empty. It felt like something waiting, the kind that comes before a decision no one quite knows how to make. And in that space, the man at the counter shifted his weight once more, his fingers pressing flat against the wood, as if grounding himself in something familiar. "You are asking us to take a great deal on very little," he said finally, though his voice had lost the edge it once carried, replaced now with something closer to caution, and perhaps even a trace of uncertainty he could not quite hide. Wyatt did not answer him right away. He simply stood there, one hand resting loosely at his side, his attention not divided but steady, as if the answer had already been given and all that remained was whether the room was willing to hear it. Evelyn remained where she was, her posture unchanged, but there was a quiet shift in her presence now, not louder, not more forceful, just more certain, as if the ground beneath her had found its place. The woman in the hat glanced between them, her earlier confidence thinning further. "If someone sent for her," she said, slower now, "then there ought to be a record, something filed, something official." And she looked to the man at the counter as if he might produce it simply by being asked. He hesitated, then reached for a drawer beneath the counter, pulling it open with a soft scrape, rifling through a stack of papers that suddenly seemed less orderly than before, each one lifted and set aside with a little more care than he had shown earlier, as though the act of searching itself required a different kind of attention now. The room watched him, the quiet stretching out with each passing second, the sound of paper shifting against paper the only thing breaking it, until at last he paused, one sheet held between his fingers, his eyes narrowing as he read something that had not been there a moment ago. Outside, a horse snorted softly, the sound drifting in through the open window, and inside, the man's expression changed in a way that was small but unmistakable, the certainty in his posture giving way to something else, something that did not sit as comfortably. He looked up, not at Evelyn at first, but at Wyatt, as if seeking confirmation without wanting to ask for it. And then, slowly, his gaze moved to her. "There is a notice," he said, the words coming slower than before, "filed 2 weeks ago." And he cleared his throat, adjusting his grip on the paper. "Regarding an expected arrival." And though he did not say her name, the room seemed to understand it all the same. The woman in the hat straightened, her lips parting slightly as if to speak, then closing again when no words came, and for the first time since Evelyn had entered, no one looked at her as though she did not belong. Evelyn did not move, did not step forward or claim the space that had quietly opened for her. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, her hands still, as if this moment, this recognition, was not something she needed to reach for, only something she had been waiting to arrive. Wyatt watched her, not with surprise, not with doubt, but with something quieter, something that settled in the space between them like understanding. And when he finally spoke, it was not to the room, but to her, his voice low and even. "Seems you came to the right place after all." And there was no triumph in it, no sense of being proven right, just a simple acknowledgement of what had always been true, even when no one had taken the time to see it. The paper in the man's hand seemed to weigh more than it should, not because of what it was made of, but because of what it confirmed, and he held it there a moment longer, as if giving himself time to understand it before anyone else did. The room leaned toward him without moving, attention drawn tight as a pulled wire, and when he finally set the paper down on the counter, the sound it made was softer than expected but carried farther than it had any right to. "It is official," he said, though. The words came slower now, careful, filed under the county records, signed and sealed, and he did not need to say more than that for the meaning to settle in. The woman in the hat shifted her weight again, her gloved hand brushing lightly against the edge of the counter as if testing whether it still felt the same. "Then why was nothing said?" she asked, though it was less a challenge now and more a question directed at no one in particular. The man at the counter did not answer her, his eyes still on Evelyn, measuring something new this time, something that had not been there before, and for a brief moment he seemed uncertain where to place his voice, how to address her, what tone belonged in this new version of the room. Evelyn stood unchanged, the same quiet posture, the same steady breath, but the silence around her had shifted shape, no longer empty, no longer dismissive, but filled with something else, something closer to attention, and yet she did not step into it, did not claim it, as if she understood that what mattered had nothing to do with how they looked at her now. Wyatt watched the change move through the room the way a man watches a storm roll off across open land, not surprised, not hurried, just aware of where it had been and where it was going. "Looks like the letter was not mistaken after all," he said, his tone even, not adding weight, not taking any away, and the man at the counter gave a small nod, the kind that comes when a fact leaves no room for argument. "Miss," he began, then paused, the word hanging there unfinished, and it was a small thing, that hesitation, but it carried more meaning than any of them might have expected, because it was the first time he had stopped to consider how to address her. Evelyn lifted her gaze to him, not helping, not correcting, simply waiting, and after a moment he continued. "Miss Hale," he said, the name landing differently in the room than it had any right to, as if it had been there all along and only now found its place. The effect was quiet but undeniable. The woman in the hat drawing in a breath she did not quite release, the others shifting slightly, adjusting themselves around. Something they had not accounted for before. Evelyn did not react outwardly, but there was a stillness in her that deepened, not pride, not satisfaction, just a kind of alignment, as if a piece had finally settled where it belonged. Wyatt's eyes moved to her again, not surprised by the name, but by the way it had changed the room more than it had changed her. And he understood then that whatever had been written in that letter had not given her something new. It had only revealed what had been there all along. Outside, the sun dipped just enough to soften the light coming through the window, casting longer shadows across the floor, and inside, the space felt different now, not louder, not warmer, but clearer somehow, as if the dust that had hung in the air had finally begun to settle. "We will need to arrange proper accommodations," the man at the counter said, his voice finding a new tone, careful, respectful, though still unfamiliar on his tongue, and Evelyn inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the words without reaching for them, because the shift had never been what she came for, only what followed once the truth had finally been seen. The change in the room did not come with noise. It came with small adjustments. A chair pulled straighter, a voice lowered half a step, a glance that lingered where before it had passed over. And it was in those small things that the difference made itself known more clearly than any announcement ever could. The man at the counter cleared his throat again, this time not out of impatience, but out of habit, as if he needed something familiar to steady himself. "We have a guest house just across the street," he said, choosing his words with care. "Clean, well kept. It should suit you fine." And there was a hint of something new in his tone, something that had not been offered before, not even considered. Evelyn listened without interrupting, her hands resting lightly against the sides of her valise. And when he finished, she gave a small nod, polite, acknowledging, but not committing, and that distinction did not go unnoticed. The woman in the hat stepped closer now, her earlier sharpness replaced with something more measured, her voice softening as she spoke. "If you require anything during your stay, I am certain arrangements can be made," she said, the words careful, almost rehearsed, as if she were stepping into a role she had not expected to play. Evelyn turned her gaze to her briefly, not cold, not warm, simply present, and inclined her head again in quiet thanks. But there was no shift in her posture, no leaning into the attention that had finally found her. Wyatt watched it all from where he stood, the way the room bent itself into new shapes, around a name that had only just been spoken, and there was something in his expression that suggested he saw past it, past the change in tone and manner, to the thing beneath it, the part that had not altered at all. "You have not asked her where she intends to go," he said after a moment, his voice cutting gently through the careful politeness that had begun to settle in, and the man at the counter paused, the question landing in a space he had not yet considered. "Well," he began then, stopped, his gaze shifting back to Evelyn, uncertain now in a way he had not been earlier. "Miss Hale, where will you be staying?" And the question, simple as it was, carried more weight than it might have before, because now it was asked with the understanding that the answer mattered. Evelyn did not respond immediately, her eyes moving briefly toward the window where the light had softened into a warm, late afternoon glow, the kind that stretched long across the street and settled into the spaces between buildings. And for a moment it seemed as though she were measuring something beyond the room itself. "I have not decided yet," she said at last, her voice unchanged, steady as it had been from the start, and that answer, more than any other, seemed to unsettle the careful order that had begun to form, because it placed the choice back in her hands, not in theirs. The woman in the hat glanced at the man beside her, then back to Evelyn, as if unsure whether to offer more or step back entirely. And the man at the counter shifted again, his earlier confidence replaced with a cautious attentiveness. Wyatt's gaze remained on Evelyn, not pressing, not guiding, just waiting. And in that waiting, there was something different from the rest of the room, something that did not change with the sound of her name or the weight of a letter, something that had been there from the moment she stepped through the door. "There is a place out past the East Ridge," he said finally, his voice low, almost an afterthought, though it carried clearly enough. "Quiet, not much to look at from the outside, but it holds steady." And he paused, not adding more, not needing to, because the words themselves were not the offer, only the shape of it. Evelyn turned her head toward him again, meeting his gaze with that same calm steadiness, and for a brief second, the room fell away from both of them, leaving only the space between what had been said and what had yet to be understood, a space that felt less like uncertainty and more like the beginning of something neither of them had planned for, but both of them recognized all the same. Wyatt's words did not fill the room. They settled into it, quiet as dust drifting through late afternoon light. And for a moment no one responded, not because they had nothing to say, but because the shape of what had been said did not belong to the kind of conversations they were used to having. The man at the counter shifted his attention between them. His expression caught somewhere between obligation and restraint, as if he could feel the balance of the room tipping but did not know which way it ought to fall. "The guest house is proper," he said after a moment, his voice careful again. "Close to town, convenient for any arrangements that need to be made. And there was something in the way he said it that suggested more than convenience. Something about keeping things within reach, within sight. Evelyn listened, her gaze resting briefly on the counter before lifting again, and though she did not interrupt, there was a stillness in her that made it clear she was not being guided by the ease of what was offered. The woman in the hat nodded slightly, eager now to restore order where it had slipped. "It would be best," she added, her tone soft but insistent, "at least until everything is settled," and the word lingered in the air, undefined, as if it could shape itself into whatever outcome the room preferred. Outside, the light shifted again, stretching longer across the street, touching the edges of buildings that had stood long before any of them had a say in what passed through their doors. And inside, Wyatt remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply present in a way that did not press but did not disappear either. Evelyn's fingers moved once along the edge of her valise, a small motion, almost unnoticed, and then she lifted her eyes toward Wyatt again, not searching for direction, but acknowledging the space he had offered without claiming it for himself. "You said it holds steady," she said, her voice quiet but clear, and Wyatt gave a slight nod, the kind that did not promise more than it could carry. "It does," he answered, and nothing in his tone tried to make it sound like anything else. No embellishment, no persuasion, just the truth as he knew it. The man at the counter exhaled softly, a sound that carried both patience and something like concern. "Miss Hale," he said, more deliberate now, "you have only just arrived. It would be wise to remain where matters can be properly overseen." And though the words were measured, they carried the weight of a place accustomed to deciding what was best for others. Evelyn turned her gaze to him, steady, composed, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow around that exchange, the distance between them holding more than just space. "I appreciate the offer," she said, her tone unchanged, "but I did not come here to be overseen." And the words were not sharp, not defiant. They were simply placed, like something set down exactly where it belonged. The woman in the hat drew in a small breath, her posture tightening, while the man at the counter pressed his lips together, the argument he might have made slipping quietly out of reach. Wyatt did not react outwardly, but there was a subtle shift in the way he stood, not closer, not farther, just steadier, as if something in the room had found its alignment. Evelyn adjusted her grip on the valise once more, then let her hand fall still, her decision not announced, not explained, but present all the same. And in that quiet, it became clear that whatever path she chose next would not be shaped by the way the room had changed, but by something that had been steady in her long before she ever stepped through its door. The room did not argue with her, not out loud, but the absence of objection carried more weight than any spoken resistance. And for a moment it seemed as though everyone had stepped back from the edge of something they did not fully understand. The man at the counter lowered his gaze to the paper in front of him, though he was no longer reading it, his fingers resting still where they had once tapped with impatience. And the woman in the hat adjusted the pin at her collar, a small, unnecessary motion that gave her hands something to do. Outside, the light had softened further, the long shadows stretching across the street now reaching the steps of the office, and the quiet of the late afternoon settled in with a steadiness that matched the stillness inside. Evelyn stood where she had been, her posture unchanged, her presence no longer questioned but not yet fully understood either, and there was something in that space, something between being seen and being known, that held its own kind of silence. Wyatt shifted his weight slightly, the faint sound of his boot against the floor the only movement that marked the passing of time, and when he spoke, it was not to challenge what had been said, but to place something alongside it. "East Ridge is about 3 miles out," he said, his tone even. "Road is narrow in places, but it holds if you take it steady." And there was no insistence in his voice, no push to persuade, only the offering of a path laid out plainly. Evelyn turned her gaze to him again, not surprised, not hesitant, just attentive, as if she had already considered more than the room could see. And for a moment the distance between them felt less like space, and more like something measured and understood. 3 miles is not far," she said, her voice quiet, the words simple but carrying their own weight. And Wyatt gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged not just the distance, but the choice behind it. The man at the counter looked up then, his expression tightening slightly. "It is not the distance that concerns us," he said, though his voice lacked the firmness it once held. "It is the circumstances," and the word hung there, undefined, as if it could be shaped into caution without needing to be explained. Evelyn met his gaze, not dismissing him, not agreeing either, simply holding the space long enough for the meaning to settle where it belonged. "I have traveled farther for less certain reasons," she replied, her tone unchanged, and there was no challenge in it, only a statement of fact that did not invite contradiction. The woman in the hat glanced toward Wyatt, then back to Evelyn, her earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something that did not quite know where to stand. Wyatt's attention remained steady, not on the room, not on the shifting reactions, but on Evelyn herself. And in that focus, there was something that did not bend with the change of tone or title, something that had been present from the beginning. "I will be heading that way," he said after a moment, his voice low, as if the decision had already been made before it was spoken. "You can ride along if you choose," and the offer did not carry expectation, did not assume agreement. It simply existed, like the road he had described, there whether it was taken or not. The room seemed to pause again, not in resistance, but in recognition that whatever came next would not be decided within its walls, and Evelyn's hand moved once more along the handle of her valise, her grip steady, her gaze shifting briefly toward the doorway where the light now framed the exit in a way it had not before, as if the path forward had been waiting there all along. Quiet, patient, and unchanged by the way the room had finally learned to see her. For a moment no one moved, as if the offer itself had drawn a line through the room that could not be crossed without leaving something behind, and Evelyn stood there with the weight of it settling not on her shoulders, but somewhere quieter, somewhere deeper, the kind of place decisions come from when they have already been made long before they are spoken. The man at the counter opened his mouth as if to say something more, perhaps to remind her of what was proper, what was expected, what would be easier. But the words did not come, and after a second he simply closed it again, his hand flattening against the wood in a gesture that felt more like release than control. The woman in the hat shifted back a step, the distance small but meaningful, her earlier presence no longer pressing forward, as if she understood that whatever influence she might have had in this room did not extend beyond its walls. Wyatt did not move either, his posture unchanged, his gaze steady, not urging, not waiting with expectation, just present in a way that left the choice entirely where it belonged. Outside, the late afternoon had settled into that quiet hour when the town slowed without noticing, the sound of a distant wagon fading into the stretch of open land, the air carrying a softness that came with the lowering sun. Evelyn's fingers tightened once around the handle of her valise, not from hesitation, but from resolve, and then she lifted it slightly, testing the weight as if to remind herself she had carried it this far on her own. Her eyes moved once around the room, not lingering on any one face, not holding on to what had been said or unsaid, just taking in the space for what it was, a place she had passed through, not one she intended to remain in. Then she turned toward the doorway, the light catching along the edge of her coat as she stepped forward, each movement unhurried, unforced, the quiet kind that comes when a decision no longer needs to be defended. Wyatt stepped aside just enough to give her space to pass, not leading, not following yet, simply making room in the same way he had from the beginning. And as she crossed the threshold, the air outside seemed to meet her differently than it had before, not warmer, not kinder, just clearer, as if the path ahead had finally come into view. The boards of the porch creaked softly beneath her boots, the sound grounding in a way that the room behind her had not been, and she paused there for a brief second, not turning back, not hesitating, just standing at the edge of what had been and what would come next. Wyatt followed a step behind, his presence steady but never crowding, and when he reached her side, he did not speak right away, as if understanding that some moments held more meaning in silence than they ever could in words. Down the street, the road stretched out toward the east, narrowing as it moved beyond the last of the buildings, where the land opened into something less certain but more honest, and Evelyn's gaze settled there, not searching, not questioning, just recognizing it for what it was. 3 miles, she said quietly, more to herself than to him, and Wyatt gave a small nod beside her. Just about, he replied, his voice low, the words carrying no more than they needed to. She shifted the valise once more in her hand, then took a step forward onto the dirt road, not waiting, not looking back. And in that simple movement, it became clear that whatever had changed inside that room had not altered her course, only revealed it. And as Wyatt fell into step beside her, the distance ahead did not feel like something to be measured, but something to be lived, one steady mile at a time. The road out of Red Willow did not announce itself as anything special. It simply continued, narrowing as the last of the buildings gave way to open land, the dirt packed firm beneath their boots, the faint tracks of wagon wheels cutting lines that had been followed long before either of them had reason to notice. The town behind them faded without ceremony. Its voices and glances left where they belonged, inside walls that had already begun to settle back into their old ways. As if nothing had happened at all, Evelyn walked with the same steady rhythm she had carried from the platform to the office, her valise held close, her gaze forward, not searching for what lay ahead, but accepting it as it came, one step at a time. Wyatt kept pace beside her, not too close, not too far, his presence quiet in a way that did not intrude, the sound of his boots matching hers without effort, as if the distance between them had already found its measure. The land stretched wide on either side, low grass shifting in the late light, a fence line running off toward the horizon where the sky met the earth in a soft, unbroken line, and somewhere in the distance, a hawk circled slow and patient, carried by air that did not rush for anyone. For a while, neither of them spoke, and the silence did not feel empty. It felt earned, like something that had been cleared of everything unnecessary, leaving only what mattered behind. After a time, Wyatt glanced at her, not studying, not questioning, just acknowledging the fact that she was there beside him, and he let the moment settle before speaking. Most folks would have stayed, he said, his voice low, carrying easily in the open air. Taken the room, let the town decide what came next, and there was no judgment in it, only an observation shaped by years of watching how people chose the easier path when it was offered. Evelyn did not look at him right away, her gaze still on the road ahead, and when she answered, it was with the same calm certainty that had carried her through every moment before. I did not come here to be decided for, she said, and the words fit the space between them as naturally as the quiet had. Wyatt gave a small nod, not surprised, not needing more explanation than that, because he had seen it already in the way she stood, the way she waited, the way she chose when to speak and when to let silence do the work. The road dipped slightly as they moved farther out, the town now no more than a shape behind them, and the air shifted with it, cooler, carrying the faint scent of earth and something green hidden beneath the dry surface. You knew, Wyatt said after a while, his tone thoughtful rather than certain. Back in that room, before anyone said your name, you knew it would change things, and this time Evelyn turned her head, her eyes meeting his with that same steady clarity. And there was the smallest hint of something softer there, not quite a smile, but close enough to it to matter. A name can change a room, she said quietly, but it does not change who walks into it. And the truth of it settled between them in a way that did not need to be questioned. Wyatt's gaze held hers for a second longer before shifting back to the road, the line of it stretching ahead in quiet promise. And he let out a slow breath, something easing in his posture that had not been tight to begin with, but now seemed lighter all the same. It was not your name that changed my mind, he said after a moment, the words simple, unadorned. And Evelyn did not answer, not because she had nothing to say, but because she understood that some things were better left where they landed, complete in themselves. The sun dipped lower as they walked, the light turning warmer, softer, settling over the land in a way that made everything feel held rather than exposed. And ahead, just beyond the rise, the outline of a place began to take shape, not grand, not impressive, but steady, just as he had said, and as they moved toward it, side by side, the distance behind them seemed less like something they had left and more like something they had outgrown, leaving space for what was still quiet, still uncertain, but already beginning to feel like something that might, in time, be called home.